So earlier I introduced Tropical Storm Laura. So this was a tropical disturbance, then a depression, and then it's a tropical storm here. And so it's got that cyclonic flow and some pretty strong winds. That's what's helping get it to that category as this tropical storm. Once again, it's a wind threshold. And so we're going to put this in motion here, this low pressure area. I'm going to mean sea level pressure, so we can see it's definitely a low pressure area, but it's not as low as it's going to be. And so let's look at the pressure right now. The air pressure 1008 here in the center. So it's going to go down to below 1000 once we get on the other side of this land area here, Hispaniola and Cuba. So go ahead and put it in motion one day, in fact. So now we're over Hispaniola. I'm going to switch back to the wind. So here, this tropical storm, it's really not strengthening, really not weakening. It's just kind of keeping on its same course. And if there wasn't land here, it definitely would be intensifying, because if we go ahead and we look at the sea surface temperatures, this is a very warm part of the North Atlantic here. So the Caribbean Sea, the pinks here are the warmest temperatures. So go back to the air. Go back to our tropical storm here, put it in motion. So it's going to then make landfall over here with Cuba. So as it gets a little bit just south of the coastline, notice how it's going parallel to Cuba. Notice how it's getting over into these warm waters. And I'll go back here. And that pink area, that's very warm. And so that right now is the fuel. And so this tropical storm just getting out over there into the warm waters just south of Cuba, it's strengthening. Its winds are getting stronger. And if we go ahead and we look at its air pressure, we should expect to see that go down as well. So I zoom in, we can see this is a darkening hole, and now it's getting down closer to 1000. And so here it's essentially a much darker low pressure area, much bigger, much more pronounced than even the hurricane up above it, but more pronounced than what it was prior. So go ahead and go back. We're going to continue to move this. It's not yet a hurricane. It's still a tropical storm because it hasn't had a clearly well-defined eye. Also doesn't have the wind speeds that we have for that threshold, that 75 mile per hour threshold. Now, unfortunately, this is using kilometers per hour, so it won't be as perfect. We won't be able to see that number of 75, but nonetheless, we can still look around as we move this forward, look around at the characteristics of this tropical storm, this tropical cyclone, as it's moving now past Cuba, and now it's getting into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And so it's right about here that now it was characterized as a hurricane. No longer was it called a tropical storm Laura, it's called Hurricane Laura. And we'll go ahead and we'll zoom in and try to figure out, okay, well, does this have the characteristics of a hurricane? And the first is that clearly defined eye. We're starting to really see it there. You can see that blue. You can see essentially the blue underneath, and so that's showing. Click on that 8 kilometers per hour. So keep on zooming in, and you can see that red. Take off the wind. That red is wind speed, and so where is the red? Just outside of the eye wall. So here's the eye wall. So just outside of the eye wall in the right front quadrant. So if this is moving generally this direction here, it's kind of gone this way here, it's this right front side. So if it was going this way, it would be the right front side. If it's coming down this way, it'd be the right front side. So wherever the direction of the particular path, it's the right front quadrant, the right front portion of the hurricane is where the winds are the strongest. Go ahead and put the winds back in motion. And so now we're having a hurricane becoming more intense as it goes over, once again, the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is only going to move over time in this northwest pattern here. Now I zoomed out. Now let's go back to the mean surface sea level pressure, and we see that really dark. I mean, look at anywhere else in this particular area where you see that low of a pressure. And so as this storm, this hurricane is strengthening, as noticed by the wind speeds increasing, but also by the decreasing pressure here in the center. So now we're seeing pressure there at 1,000, so below the 1,000 number. And so as we get closer, we'll get into the 900s here once we get closer to making landfall. So go ahead and go back to the wind, and we'll get this closer to shoreline. And so this is going to only get stronger. So I'm going to advance it 1 day, and you can see now it's over here in this part of the Gulf. So if I look at wind speeds, if I go and I'll zoom in to our hurricane, our clearly defined eye, once again, right there at the eye, 2 kilometers per hour. Just outside in the eye wall, we're looking at 44, then we get further out, 76, 100, 111. And so as I go around, roughly the same distance around the eye, notice what happens to the wind speed. Still fast, but not as fast as you see there, just to the right and to the front of this advancing forward-moving hurricane. We'll once again zoom back out, and we'll watch this make landfall here as we slowly move it over time. And now it's hitting the Louisiana coast. And the winds are definitely slowing down. You can see if we zoom back in, where are the wind speeds now the fastest? You're going, wait, I thought you said the white front quarter. Well, what's happening is here, this part of the storm is hitting land. And so essentially it's lost that fuel. It's lost its intensity. It has friction as well, causing it to slow down. Meanwhile, out here, there's essentially nothing there disrupting. We have water here, so we're adding our fuel source, and so that's why at this moment when we're making landfall, this eye, the strongest winds are still very strong up here, but now we're seeing and then start to die down as the rest of the storm here has not yet made landfall. So if I go ahead and put this in motion, then you'll see it start to fade. And so what's happening now is it's losing that core, that eye. You can still see it. We're still a low pressure area. So we're still a low pressure center. We're still going to see inward spiral, but it's losing that well-defined core, that well-defined eye that we saw beforehand. Also, wind speeds are going down. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this as we go to the north and to the east. And so here, this low pressure area, bringing with it a good amount of precipitation as well. And eventually gets up to the Missouri, Illinois area. And now, if I go ahead and I zoom out, this particular low pressure area has now moved up and essentially been kind of morphed into a low pressure area up here in Indiana. And so still bringing with it a good amount of precipitation. So a lot of this is remnants from this particular tropical depression that became a tropical storm, that became a hurricane, made landfall, and then eventually went back to a tropical storm, quickly to a tropical depression, then became just essentially another mid-latitude low pressure that we find here in the Midwest all the time. Now I'm going to go back to Tropical Storm Laura and look at its precipitation pattern as it's moved across this particular area of the Gulf of Mexico. And so here we see, is it centralized? Yeah, it kind of looks something like what we see as a pinwheel, but not so much. I mean, we kind of have this inward area there, but we definitely have precipitation happening in the center of this particular storm. If we know about a hurricane, we know in the center of a hurricane eye. So we're going to actually have clear skies, calm weather. So if I go ahead and I'll move this forward 1 day, this is when it became a hurricane, and now we can see very characteristic precipitation, but also cloud pattern, which we kind of have more of that pinwheel pattern there. And you can see that very intense amount of rainfall there nearest the core of this system. Essentially, we think about that central dense overcast, that's going to be right here. And if we go ahead and move to total cloud water, we can see and take off the wind. And so this here is the core of this particular tropical cyclone. Move it forward here, going as it goes to the north and northwest. Go back to its precipitation. And we can see it's just essentially it's just an engine. And essentially that engine requires fuel, and that fuel is warm water, and that warm water is then essentially being added to the storm. And I'm not going to get too much into it, but you got latent heat being given off there, and that's adding more to the moisture, more to the fuel. And so essentially this here is just nothing but a huge amount of water. And so we go ahead and we push this forward. We can see as it makes landfall, that precipitation is quite high, and you can see it's really coming in the right front quadrant as it comes ashore. I'll come back and talk about storm surge a little bit later on in the semester, and then it continues to move on. And so it still is a precipitation event, although nothing like it was beforehand. And eventually bring precipitation to us here in Indiana.